And we're recording.
Thank you. Welcome to RBCM at Home. My name is Kim Goff, and I'm a learning program developer at the Royal BC Museum. The museum and my home are located on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen, the Songhees, and the Esquimalt First Nations in Victoria, British Columbia. I extend my appreciation for the opportunity to learn and to live on this territory. I encourage you all to consider the traditional territory on whose land you are on today, wherever you are. So this week is part of Heritage Week in British Columbia. And the theme for Heritage Week is, where do you find heritage? You might be thinking of monuments and plaques or landscapes and events. One event 56 years ago on February 18th, 1965 was an avalanche near Stewart in northwestern BC that killed 26 workers at the Granduc copper mine. The legacy of that event has been preserved in the Stewart Museum, in a town memorial, and in a documentary film. To learn more about what happened and the aftermath, I have two guests. Shirley Rosachek lives in Stewart and works at the Stewart Museum. She was a guest on RBCM at Home back in August, and you can see a recording of our visit to the Stewart Museum on the Royal BC Museum's YouTube channel. Ron Goetz is a filmmaker with Partners in Motions and has produced a documentary on the slide as part of a series called Disasters of the Century. You can stream the documentary from Amazon Prime, or as of February the 18th, on his YouTube channel, Bad Day HQ, which hosts primarily historical material. Before becoming a filmmaker, Ron lived in the Stewart area as a teenager and as a young adult. And in addition to hiking around the old mine sites, he worked at the Granduc warehouse for 3 years. Hello, both of you, and welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shirley, let's start by hearing from you.
Okay, so I guess you can't really talk. The story of Granduc was incredible. In the early 1960s, Granduc brought prosperity to the historic mining town of Stewart, BC. Stewart is located at the head of the Portland Canal, and we're about 2 miles from Hyder, Alaska, on the southern tip of the Alaskan Panhandle. So our neighbors in Hyder, hello today too. Stewart was to have another boom, and after a very long downturn in its history. The Granduc Operating Company constructed a residential suburb in the town site, modern homes and apartments, and for about 750 working men with families, they stayed in the town. New schools and hospitals were built and for the growing population, and a new community center was put up to provide a focus for many of Stewart's activities, their social activities. Stewart, of course, was very remote and had no road access until 1974. So transportation into the town site was, first of all, lower right-hand screen, via Trans-Provincial Airlines from Prince Rupert to the Stewart Airport in a 12-seater Grumman Goose. An alternate form of transportation was available by water, and Granduc themselves owned a vessel called the Lumba Lumba. It could accommodate 30 passengers in aircraft-style seating, and believe me, I'm sure they had some many rough trips coming up in the wintertime to Stewart. For many of the workers that came to Stewart, once they got here, would they stay and work? Well, maybe not. Some just got off, looked around and went, this isn't for me and I'm out of here. Remoteness in mining is a real challenge to get people to come here to work. If you stayed, you ended up with a long 32-mile journey up to the mine on a crazy road. So Granduc is located at the headwaters of the Leduc River, 25 miles north of Stewart. Nothing about the development of Granduc was easy. The deep ore body was partially covered by glacier, so open pit mining was not really feasible. The terrain was too rugged for overland access to tidewater in Stewart, and weather too treacherous to permit building a concentrator at the location of the main ore body. The most feasible and nearest site for the concentrator was 11 miles away. The solution for this was to drive a tunnel under intervening mountain ranges and glaciers from the mine to the concentrator. The endeavor was to be challenged by some of the most severe obstacles in nature ever placed in the path of a mineral discovery or mine development. September 1964, tunneling began. Once again, the tunnel was 11 miles in length, passed under 3 glaciers and 3 mountain ranges over 7,000 feet high. Because the tunnel was the lifeline of Granduc, it had to be designed for fast, large-scale, safe transport for people, ore, and the supplies that were moving back and forth through the tunnels. 15 feet in diameter, it needed to carry a high-speed railway system in the tunnel, and was driven by crews in camps from both ends, one on the Leduc camp, where the main ore body was, the other at Tide Lake, where the concentrator was to be built. By February 1965, the men at Leduc camp had driven 28 feet. And on February 18th, 1965, with 154 men in camp, disaster struck. An avalanche roared down, demolishing most of the camp. 68 men were caught in the avalanche, 26 of those killed and 20 injured. And from there, we'll go back to Ron for a little bit more information on the slide itself and some other information on the mine.
Great. Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be with you today. I looked at some of the participants, recognized some familiar names from when I lived in Stewart. And so I've made it sort of almost a kind of major part of my life to do a lot of historical documentaries, and almost all our programming, as Kim mentioned, is historical. I love the time I spent in Stewart. It's a hard place to describe because of its history and its natural beauty and its ruggedness. So I always found, I think once you've been to Stewart, it's something that stays in your blood. It's just one of those really special places that's hard to forget. So I just wanted to go, there is a picture I want to share. I know I'm going to try to do this. First of all, I guess I better share. We're going to try this. I hope you can see that okay.
Not yet, Ron. So if you select your share screen and then try opening it again. Lee Murphy has a question for Ron. Go ahead and type your question in there, Lee.
Oh, there we go, probably. Let me just get this up first.
You bet.
How's that?
Oh, that's quite beautiful. So
okay, so this is a picture off an old brochure. Some of you might recognize it, but it does give a really good description of the head of the Portland Canal. And so this gives you some idea of what the challenge was with the Granduc mine. So as Shirley pointed out, here's, if you can see my cursor, this is Stewart. The loading facility is down here. Bear Glacier is around the corner up here, and this is the Bear River. And on this side, of course, this line along here, of course, is the Canada-US border. So this is the Canadian side, the US side is on this side, and this is the Salmon River. And back here is the Salmon Glacier. And so Leduc is actually way back in here. You'd have to go up the glacier and over. And so to get it from there to the concentrator, you could see that it would be almost an impossible task. And so Tide Lake was here. So the idea is that the tunnel would be driven through all these glaciers and mountains to Tide Lake, then would be taken by truck all the way down to the concentrator. And if you look carefully, you can see a very thin line here. It's very faint. That's the Tide Lake Mine Road, close to the glacier, just as you come around to see the glacier. So that gives you an idea of just really the challenge that there was there. And so the idea when they were driving the tunnel is that while they were building the concentrator, they would be, for the trying to get the tunnel done quickly, they would, as most tunnels are. In a lot of cases, they're driven from both ends and they meet in the middle. So that was the idea behind the idea of trying to get this tunnel done quickly. There's one other, I'm going to stop sharing for a second and just see if, this might be quite interesting. So, I don't share my screen too often, so that's a bit of a challenge for me. So if you can see this, this is the Salmon Glacier as it goes up to the Leduc. This picture was taken in July. So you can still see there's quite a bit of snow on the glacier. And so what they would do is they would, before the tunnel was, and the tunnel from Leduc would have been on this side, they would use cats to go up into and over into the Leduc area. So the glacier is fairly flat in here. And so the snow, even in July, there's quite a bit of snow. And let me just, I'm trying to minimize this so I can get the pic. Oh, there we go. Okay, so now this is a horrible picture, but it's important to understand this. So this is actually a glacier around February, March, about the time. It's a picture I took, but it's very badly been damaged. And so you can see a lot of speckles, but you can see how the crevices have been really covered in the snow. And so the cats would go along these types of, well, maybe not quite as steep as this, but in some cases fairly close to the steepness to get up to Leduc. And a lot of snow accumulated on the mountain. And so that was the challenge that we had with Leduc. So that's sort of the background of it. And so during this time, as Shirley pointed out, and I'll just get a picture of a lot of the work. This is a couple of scenes from the actual film. So lots of people it was very bad weather that day. And so some of the workers couldn't really work outside. They pretty much had to stay inside. They were playing cards or waiting for the weather to get better. And a couple of workers were working on the roofs because of the heavy snow. They didn't want it to collapse. So there was a combination of people working in the tunnel, some people working to get rid of the snow on the buildings, and others just kind of waiting it out. And so I'm going to try to play a little clip here if I can. Let's see if we can get that. If we can get that work, that'll be something. Nope. Well, we won't worry about that today. So as I said, it was snowing fairly heavily. They were trying to construct a camp still. They were still trying to put up buildings. And at some point, they just could not work anymore. And so they started to go inside. And then, of course, when the avalanche came, the reason the avalanche came, and I'm just going to go to this picture while we're talking about it, is that the snowpack had been relatively light through most of that particular year. And so it had crystallized. And when it crystallized, the new snow that was falling in February, which was pretty heavy, it actually it breaks much easier and it slides down. So this is what caused the avalanche in a relatively, as they thought, was a relatively safe area. And so the avalanche was a bit of a surprise. And of course, the end result was a significant amount of snow came down, buried a number of miners. And for the longest time, there was 27 missing. They did find one a few days later. And then, of course, 26 people perished in that avalanche. The workers in the tunnel, of course, were protected. They didn't really know what was going on. The only reason they knew something was going on was because the ventilation system had been shut down, and because of the loss of power when the avalanche came down the mountain. So the radio, the only good part of if there was a good part, was that the radio shack was not destroyed. though the power was destroyed, the operator was able to connect the radio to batteries and was able to call for help. And I think it was received somewhere in Ketchikan, and then it was relayed to the mine office in Stewart and to the RCMP and to others. So it was quite a rescue effort. It took a number of days because of heavy snow. Helicopters couldn't get in right away. And so it was a pretty significant avalanche by Canadian standards, still one of the top worst avalanches in Canada.
My goodness. Can you tell us a little bit more about the rescue efforts, having just seen how remote everything is there? How quickly were people on the scene to help?
Well, there were survivors. All the miners in the tunnels worked right away. So when they got out, they started looking for people, and some were buried, only a few feet, and were able to actually get out on their own. They didn't have to need any help. They just stood up, and others were buried maybe 5 or 6 feet, had to be sort of rescued and dug out. And so then the missing ones seem to be all piled up in one area. So as far as the rescues, there were some people right on the spot. And if I remember correctly, there was actually a doctor visiting the site that day. And so there was a medical person by chance at the at the place, and the bunkhouse was still standing. So they were able to use that as a makeshift hospital. The workshop and the power plant and all that was, of course, destroyed. And so when the call went out, there were people that left from Ketchikan. There were people that left from Stewart up to the glacier to try to go across the glacier. And then, of course, there were the Canadian RCMP had sent people. So there were all these people trying to sort of come together to help this particular camp out. The food was destroyed. They were able to find food, and one of the interesting stories was they used shovels as frying pans on an open fire to cook their steaks, and so that's how they were able to, they melted snow and they were able to cook some of their food using shovels, which I thought was kind of interesting. Some of the helicopters couldn't get in for, I think the disasters happened on a Thursday, and some of the first helicopters that were able to arrive wasn't until Saturday. So they were quite on their own. They were alone for quite a while, over almost 2 full days.
So almost 2 full days. You mentioned that one man was found. Was it how many days later? He was buried underground for a number of days, I believe.
Yeah, there was a point where they decided, and I think he was discovered, I think about 5 days after the avalanche. And what had happened was he was under some plywood, I guess wood from one of the buildings. I think he was in the workshop, so it had probably been something from the workshop building, but they were building a platform for the helicopters to land, and they kept driving either very close to him or almost over him, but they couldn't hear him. And so eventually, as the caterpillar was grading the snow, this piece of plywood kind of popped up, and so did he, and that's how he was discovered. He was the last person rescued, and the rest, some of the bodies, I think it was months before they found all the bodies, because some were so badly buried in the snow that they just couldn't get them till the thaw started.
Wow. There's a comment here from Johan Slam, and Johan says that there was a gentleman found a few days after the avalanche and was located by an avalanche dog. Do you know that story, Ron?
No, but I do know that they use dogs, and it is in the documentary. It's likely that the dogs did have some trouble, I understand, because of all the smells and chemical smells. It was somewhat masked, but I do know that they did bring dogs in, and I'm not even sure how successful that was.
Yeah, Johan believes that the first live dog find happened here at the Granduc, although there's some contrary reports that the first avalanche dog find wasn't until Fernie in the 2000s. So that's interesting. It would be interesting to know more about that.
Yeah, dogs were used though. Yep, for sure.
Oh, yeah, he says archived in the Vancouver Sun later that week. So there's where it is. Thank you, Johan. There are, there's a couple more questions, but I think before we go to that, I think it's really important to note that this was happening during construction of the site. So this wasn't a complete camp. It probably, I guess it sounds like it wasn't in full operation. Is that correct?
Oh, well, the mill was, and yeah, they weren't mining. This was trying to put it into production. So the tunnel had not even been finished yet. And matter of fact, there hadn't been much done on the Leduc side. And the term Granduc, some of your attendees will know this, but the Granduc stands for the Grand B Mining Company, and Leduc, or the Duke part, stands for the Leduc ore body. So that's how they got Granduc. And so the idea, as Shirley explained, is that they were trying to take the ore from the Granduc to Tide Lake. And so they were still building that. There was no tunnel. So it wasn't like you could send a train down there to help rescue these people. It all had to be done either by cat or by helicopter. There really was no other way of getting in.
Amazing. And you said there were about 156 men working there at the time.
Yeah.
And it looked like from the documentary, they were all ages. There was kind of a teenager looking guy in there. Was that purposeful? Were they like, what was?
It was a mixed group. People, I mean, it's a rugged life for these, but it's good money. So people who wanted a job and wanted to make money and didn't mind the isolation, and I don't think they worried too much about the danger, but it was isolation and good money. This was a good job. And so they would work, and some would work for a few days, I think, and said, no, I can't take this, and would go home. And others would stay on and work for Granduc for many years.
Speaking of people who work there, Lee Murphy is here in the attendee room. And Lee said that he worked with you, Ron, at the warehouse the same time that you did.
Hi, Lee. How are you?
And that he flew into Leduc camp by helicopter in 1974 to do an inventory of the old camp. And it was a very spooky place in 1974, as most of the camp was still there with dishes and all the cooking stuff. What is left of this camp today?
I can't answer that question. Maybe Lee can. Because I have not been back. Matter of fact, there's not much left of Granduc. I think most of the concentrator, I'm talking about Tide Lake now, the Tide Lake camp, I think everything is pretty much gone. You can still drive there, though, you go the road. And that's the other thing that we didn't mention, is that even the road from Tide Lake to Stewart had its own challenges, and Avalanche challenges were pretty significant. And so there is a tunnel I guess, past the summit of where the road would go back down to the Granduc, where there's a mile-long tunnel. So they even had to drive a tunnel on the road, and it's a straight tunnel, 1 mile long. Pretty amazing.
That is amazing. Well, thinking of the legacy of the mine, but also of the Avalanche, Shirley, how does the town of Stewart remember the Granduc mine avalanche?
I think that Granduc, there's still people that always have memories. These are just some of the clips of the mine when it was actually complete. Definitely all of these concentrator buildings on the left upper side are gone, and the lower side, some pieces of equipment are left at the mine, but on the Leduc campsite, it's just some old rubble that was cleaned up. There's nothing really visible. I do believe there is a marker there to remember the men that passed away at that site. So for us, what do we see here at the museum? We have a lot of information on the mine itself and all the underground workings. I'm definitely not an expert at that. Photos of the exploration camp in 1955 to 56 is here in an album that was donated 2 years ago to us. A collection of news stories about the disaster itself. And of course, probably one of the best coverages was done by the Toronto Star Weekly. Get that out. The disaster, they actually did live interview with Einar Malilla, who was the gentleman that was found, had been buried for over 3 days and managed to survive. He had many challenges, frostbite. They had flown actually a hyperbaric chamber to assist in his recovery in Vancouver. And he did survive. So that was one good thing, but never was wanting to go back into the mountains after his experience there for sure. One of our most treasured records, of course, is, sorry, Anna's had to leave here for a second. There is the interview with Einar Malilla. And a few years ago, I guess it was in just before the 50th anniversary of the Granduc slide, so that would have been 2015, we had also been finishing up our cemetery project. As some of you may or may not know, Stewart has unfortunately lost 2 cemeteries. The first one in 1910, but to the Bear River. Our second one of around 1964 from a massive landslide, another of nature's natural disasters. So the only cemetery we have left to show today is the Wards Pass Cemetery just outside of town. And believe it or not, only 2 of the men that passed away at Granduc are interned at the cemetery. One of those is a gentleman by the name of Vilmos Fiquet. Vilmos, this story is very, very interesting, and we're very proud to have actually reconnected a family who had lost their loved one for over 50 years. Vilmos came to Canada from Hungary in about 1956. He was part of the Hungarian Revolution. So he had to flee the country, and he left behind his wife and 2 children, Vilmos Jr. and his sister. And they received letters, they received gifts of monies and gifts, and I understand also vaccine for the village children over in Hungary. And then for a period of time, they heard nothing from Vilmos. It was about a year later, and they received a check in the mail for $2,500 in the form of a life insurance policy. Now, what you have to remember is during the Revolution years, any correspondence going back to the family was actually edited. So they didn't know where their father had died. They didn't know why he had died, didn't know where he was buried. So for 50 years, wondering happened. And we had posted our cemetery gravestones. You can see the headstone at Wards Pass in the top right corner there. And about 3 days before the 50th anniversary, I got a call from a gentleman down in the US who asked me if that picture was real, and if it was, how could he get here? So he'd explained to me that they'd lost their father, and this is the first time in 50 years that they were able to find out information about him. So July of 2015, we were very, very proud to host Vilmos Jr. And his wife, and who had experienced a tragedy in their lives with their young son named Vilmos. And it was during the search on the internet about his trial that Vilmos's gravestone came up. So I really, really like to thank Mary Trace, who was one of our head leaders on our cemetery project, and for her posting all of these headstones on Find a Grave. This family would have never been reunited. So we're very, very proud of that. We wanted to actually take those names that are on the monument in our park and try to put faces to them. We were successful with many of the men. We've also done their genealogy. So we have a great record book here in the museum for that. If you're here in Stewart, come on in and see us. We'll talk to you lots about Granduc and show you a lot of things in our display behind me. Also, take a walk in the park down at the boardwalk. You'll see the monument dedicated to the 26 men that passed away at Granduc. And that is our story from my end. And Ron, I really, really want to thank you for your production. I've seen it many times, played it here in the museum. It was actually gifted to the Vilmos family to help them understand what actually took place in coincidence with their father's passing. So it was a tool for healing for them. So I thank you very much for that. And I'll turn you back to Kim.
Oh, it's awesome. Great.
Thank you, Shirley. I'll ask you to stop sharing your screen there as we wrap up. That's a really touching story and such an important example of how sharing these stories of the past have an impact on people today, and the importance of the work that you do at your museum, and the importance of the film and helping people understand and to reconnect. So if you are able to visit Stewart, or maybe you live there, maybe on the 18th, you can wander past that monument and think of those lives that were lost. Although it might be buried under a bunch of snow still, if I understand Stewart correctly. And then on the 18th, you can see the documentary on Bad Day HQ on YouTube. Ron, what is the exact name of the documentary if people want to search it?
It's it'll be the Granduc Avalanche. They can just type it in when they go to Bad Day HQ. They can just type it in, and it should come up on the 18th. If they're a subscriber, it'll automatically send them a notice. So, but it won't be that hard to find.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. And for those of you who joined us, if you joined us late and missed something, or you'd like to go back or share this, it has been recorded and you will find it on the Royal BC Museum's YouTube channel. So please have a look there. Our museum has reopened and we are ready to welcome you back. You can find out more on our website about time, tickets, and exhibit. Next week, February 23rd, my guest will be Parks Canada archaeologist and a traditional knowledge holder with the Nahanni Consensus team to talk about archaeological discoveries at the Nahanni National Park Reserve. I hope you'll join us. Until then, take care of yourselves and one another.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you both.
Bye-bye.